Farmers have been practicing fuel conservation for some time, mainly to reduce their own farm costs. One method of conserving fuel has been to reduce the tillage by coupling equipment together and taking more than one piece of equipment, obviously behind the tractor. Also, a comparatively new system of minimum or no tillage method is being used quite successfully, in which crops are planted directly through the residue of the previous years instead of the conventional plowing and tillage operations. Those who really support this method of farming feel that they can save about 50% of the fuel consumption for these conventional operations. Farmers have been using diesel-powered tractors at an increasing rate. It takes about 36% more gasoline to do the same job that a gallon of diesel fuel will do. By 1980, it is projected that diesel fuel will power 90% of the on-farm tractors. Scientists are exploring the possibility of using agriculture as a major source of fuel for the future. Corn and wheat can be used to produce alcohol, which can be used as a fuel. Soybean oil is being chemically treated and then physically distilled to produce a gasoline substitute. Some solid waste can be recycled into the soil for organic matter and fertilizer value. Also, we can use more natural fibers in place of the energy-consuming synthetic fibers, which now account for about 60% of the fiber market in the country. In conclusion, it appears that the energy shortage will be with us for several years, but certainly any crisis situation can be alleviated by continuing and expanding conservation methods and by adopting allocations to meet high priority needs.
Thank you, Harold. In hearing the earlier lectures and hearing the comments that have been made so far, it seems to me as if the discussion involves two areas. One is the gasoline shortage and the extent to which that is going to be a deepening problem and how to deal with it. And then as the broader question of the shortage of resources, not only of agriculture, but all of mineral resources. I wonder if we might just discuss the first of those questions a little bit and then go to the second area in a more of a free-flowing give and take. One of the questions that I, as a newsman, had a great deal of problem getting any answers to earlier in the crisis or energy shortage was some hard data on just how much gasoline was used in Iowa for different purposes and what the refining capacity was of the companies sending gasoline into Iowa and whether this was static or was being increased and whether the refineries that were in operation were operating at 100% or at something below that. Mr. Beltz, I wonder if you could give us any information on the amount of refinery capacity in serving Iowa and the extent to which this is static or growing.
Well, let me try to answer your question a little bit backward because I'm not familiar with the total details on refining capacity as it applies to the state of Iowa and what comes into this state in total. We are required to give the state that information so that we can determine what the set-aside percentage, the number of gallons will be. So that those figures are available. I do not have them. But from the standpoint of our own company again, which I speak, we have 3 refineries which feed into the state of Iowa. Our Whiting Refinery, our Wood River Refinery, and our refinery in Kansas. I can't think of the name of it right at the moment. And we have 3 basic facets of business in the state of Iowa. Just simply, they're retail, consumer, and commercial. I'm perhaps more familiar with the consumer portion, which involves the agricultural production or the farm trade. Since we've had the energy crisis, we have, as I stated before, unless there's been an error in my judgment or I've been lulled to sleep, and we have made some mistakes, I will repeat that because we deal with human beings, we have not allowed a farmer to run out of fuel under any conditions. We are not allowing that to happen now. We have extensive pressure, as as you mentioned, Earl, because there's been a lot of work done in the past 10 days in the farm channel, and just by virtue of numbers alone, it puts a lot of pressure on our distribution system. We have approximately 400 bulk agents in the state of Iowa which deliver to our farm trade. However, so far we're able to keep up. That isn't true in all portions of the farm business because I'm also involved in fertilizer, and I guess we didn't come here to talk about that. But from the standpoint of diesel fuel and gasoline, we intend to follow through with the rules of the mandatory allocation program, which is 100% of the farmers' requirements. And thus far, we've been able to do that. In the particular, in the farm channel of our business in the state of Iowa, we sell approximately 200 million gallons of diesel fuel and gasoline, our own company. And of course, that's just one group.
Do you have any plans for increasing refinery capacity?
We have plans, and again, I'm not in the refining end of the business, and we are presently spending $80 million at our Texas City refinery to modify our equipment down there so that we can accept what we call sour crude, which is crude oil basically that comes from the Middle East that's high in sulfur. And many of the refineries in this country are not equipped to handle a sour crude, and that's why some of the refineries were not able to run at a higher capacity rate than they were last year. Last year we ran our refineries at approximately 94% of capacity, and at this point in time, we are running our refineries at 76% of capacity, which is a part of the mandatory allocation rules.
Maury or Sam, do you have any information on the outlook in Iowa as far as the amount of petroleum products available?
Well, as I said earlier, the commitment that's been made by the industry with the redirection of the FEO would indicate that through the summer here, unless we have a continuance of the Arab embargo, we're going to get all that agriculture needs, and someplace in the neighborhood of 90% of what the retail filling stations sold in the comparable months in 1972, and that with the conservation program that our people have been willing to participate in ought to get us by without any gasoline shortages. Now, we're going to have a severe problem, I think, on propane this fall, but between now and October 1, unless there is a disruption of the flow of import fuel, I really anticipate no serious problem.
I should have made my question clear. What I meant really was for the longer term period beyond this year.
No, I think that there's been a lack of refinery capacity construction in the United States, mainly resulting from the fact that more and more of the crude was going to come from overseas. Everyone knew that. All the charts showed that, and of course the money flow was over there. And I think the decision was made justifiably that the refineries would probably be built over there. We've not had refinery construction in the United States to amount to anything for the past 15 years. There's been some holdup on the part of environmental concerns, but that's not been the reason the refineries haven't been built. It's been an economic decision. But nothing has changed, no plans have changed on that so far as I know, that I can get firm.
One of the questions where there was some disagreement between Commoner and Hubbard was the extent to which there has been a continuing active exploration policy by the oil companies. That was whether this hinged on the question of whether we are running out of oil or not. Commoner's view was that we weren't finding oil because we weren't looking for it. Hubbard's view was that we weren't finding oil because the amount of oil in the country is being depleted. Do any of you gentlemen have anything to comment on that?
Any resource that you wish to bring into use must fit the criteria of concentration, which is judged again on an economic level. There are hundreds of tons of gold dissolved in the ocean, but it's so dispersed that the amount of energy would be to get it into native metal form is so great that it would outvalue the gold beyond the value of the gold. The same is true with gas, the same is true with iron, petroleum. So therefore, the economics of relationship to cost of extraction and cost of delivery as played off against return on it are very critical factors. We have a lot of natural gas wells in the United States that have been capped. As a matter of fact, I had a piece of property up in western New York about 15 years ago that had a gas well on it. And it would accumulate under gravity so that you could get about a month's natural gas use out of it into the tanks that were connected to it. Now, that was not a commercial gas well. It was nice because it gave us some pretty free natural gas once a month or once a year for a month, but it was not a commercial well. Now, if the price of gas had gone up very significantly, the economic value of that would have brought it into the category of being a resource. And you've heard tales, and I've heard tales about the thousands of wells that are capped. A stripper well, all of a sudden, under the Cost of Living Council edict 2 years ago, became a highly desirable thing in North America. Stripper well is something that's defined that produces 10 barrels of oil or less a day. They're a drug on the market until the Cost of Living Council said you can charge whatever you want for the petroleum that comes out of a stripper well. All of a sudden, a stripper well at 10 barrels a day production was a lot more desirable than a well that would produce 20 barrels a day. So you're looking at those kinds of relationships. Now also, under the actions of wellhead pricing of gas by FPC, and by the highly competitive relationship that many oil companies experienced, and also the high economic cost of doing business in North America as opposed to elsewhere in the world, caused the petroleum companies to utilize their depletion allowances not to look for petroleum in continental U.S. or even just North America, because the cost of extracting a barrel of oil in Saudi Arabia, for instance, is about 11, 13 cents a barrel. That's 42 gallons to a barrel. Now, if you operate in the free enterprise system, that the first thing you must do is show a profit, and the best thing you can do is show a better profit. It's not too surprising that many of the companies of sufficient size to be international companies took their money and went to explore in the Arabian, North African countries, Malaya and so forth. Now, there's been a lot of talk about environmental constraints, but all of these patterns were in place before any environmentalist had been heard loud enough to make any kind of an impact on a choice of where you would use your money for operations. So I think that our dependence on foreign crude is a very natural phenomena of a very high and expensive standard of living that we have in North America, cost of doing business here, and some rather short-sighted federal regulation, and the fact that the basic ethic in industry is profit. And I don't think it's worthwhile to criticize industry for operating on the ethic that society has given it.
Okay, I think that might, yeah, Jim, you have.
I'd like to add something to what Sam has said. It's exactly true that the high cost of labor and productivity in this country has seen the movement towards Arab oil because it's cheaper to produce, and this was a significant problem in the early 50s, and that then led to the import quota system to protect the price of domestic oil. But in addition to this, there was an international political move that was extremely significant, perhaps even more so, and that was when the royalties charged by our Arabian countries was allowed as a deductible tax from domestic income tax. And this was perpetrated by activities from the State Department at a time when they felt that the Arab nations were in danger of being weaned away by Russia. And it was purely an international political move to cement the Persian Gulf nations to the oil companies. This worked real fine for the oil companies until they were nationalized. Now they're all coming home because they can't make the money in the Persian Gulf anymore. Now we're seeing a return to domestic issues, return to stripper well productivity and so on, and especially the expansion into other forms of energy. Now, when we talk about where is capital going out of energy, all you have to do is look at the 7 major oil companies, and you find that they're involved not only in oil, but in coal and uranium and geothermal. So the profits that these companies have made have now extended into the other resource areas, and we begin to ask some questions of ourselves. If these multinational corporations can be considered something less than nationalistic in their spirit, what do we gain by turning over the rest of these major energy resources to the same type of a system? And I think that's the basic question that we have to ask ourselves, and that's the one that Commoner raised.
What's the alternative, Jim? I'd be interested in what you think the alternative.
Well, you've heard of TVA. Yeah, I think that it ranges all the way from extraction taxes to full disclosure to a government corporation that, of the type that TVA has shown and the type that they're attempting to set up, not very well, but attempting to set up on the breeder program.
I'm not very impressed with the record of TVA. There's also another.
Well, I'm unimpressed with the oil companies, so I guess it's about even Steven.
I really, maybe I've got a dim view of the federal government and all government really. I have serious doubt in my mind that the federal government could run a gas station.
Well, it's obvious the oil companies can't.
TVA stayed in one place, but because you can't lose a river. Nationalization is a ready sort of response. And I seriously doubt its efficacy.
I think the most important debate that's going to be going on for the balance of this century is just on that point right there, and that is, what part does the private sector play and what part does the public sector play? And what I think are going to be the two most important issues from now on till the year 2000, that's energy and transportation. I don't think we have evolved or developed the right kind of a relationship between the two ways we can go in this country to do anything. I'm not as unhappy with the performance of the federal government as Sam, perhaps. I think we talk about the post office, and we assume that Montgomery Ward or AT&T could run the post office. I'm not at all sure that's true. I think the federal government has done some things very, very well. I doubt whether the private sector could do them any better, and I think we tend to overlook those. I'm terribly distressed by this, by the oil companies becoming energy companies. The Congress back there is milling around. We talk about the inability of the administration or the crippled presidency, but if someone will tell me why the Congress has had hearing after hearing after hearing and nothing's come out of it. Certainly there's two things that Congress could do very quickly. One, make the oil companies divest themselves of their pipelines, both the crude lines and the finished product lines. There's no one in the United States, I'm sure, that could prove to any of us that that works to the benefit of the public. And secondly, there's no reason in the world why we should let them become energy companies. One of the electric utilities in this state bought a coal mine several years ago, and it's been a disaster for that company financially, frankly. But they bought it, and we watch it. And a few months ago, it's in Wyoming, it's low sulfur coal. A few months ago, they were bid more than 3 times what the book value of that coal mine was, and it became very tempting for them to sell it. And of course, the need for that coal mine as a property, the electric utility, is greater today than it was when they bought it. They were bid this price by an oil company. I've had conversations with all these oil company people, so I called the vice president of the company up and I said, what in the world, man? I've seen your ads where you're terribly short of capital for exploration and development. What in the world do you want to get in the coal business for? And he says, we're no longer an oil company, we're an energy company. Well, I'm telling you, I don't want the oil companies to control the coal in this country. I'd like to have some independent coal people trying to get my energy business and some independent companies in all other areas. Now, when we give the cattlemen all the hogs and chicken to raise, we're in trouble. As long as the cattlemen and the hogmen and the chickenmen compete, we got a chance, you know. So there's no purpose in the Congress sitting there and trying to find some reason not to force divestiture of those non-petroleum properties that the oil companies are rapidly accumulating.
Could I
Go ahead, Senator.
chip in here? My lack of enthusiasm for the federal government shouldn't be interpreted as a complete approbation of private industry. But I do think we have a very basic decision to make as a society. One is whether vital commodities can operate satisfactorily under a free market system. I don't happen to believe that the petroleum industry today, in a time of shortage, is marketing petroleum only. they are experiencing considerable market benefit from marketing a shortage. Now, I really think we have as a society decide whether we're going to take vital commodities that touch every individual or basic fundamental structural parts of our society and put it on a cost of service basis with a guaranteed profit as we do with electricity and telephones and so forth, or whether we're going to say the free market, the supply and demand relationship will endure. I don't think it's a simple decision, and I think the reason I object to the TVA analogy is that I think that's a simplistic solution. The Exxon Corporation isn't, as a bureaucracy, is very little different from the United States government. Industry, whether it's inside government or outside government, is a bureaucracy.
How about ComSat, though, Sam? They tell me that the communication satellite is some kind of an organization, half of American Telephone and Telegraph and half the federal government. Or how about our weapons development, which end up in airplane development? They tell me the reason that we have almost all the airplane business in the entire world, and you can fly in and out of every airport in the world, it's one of the real proud things you notice, that they're American airplanes, is because we took the for-profit system represented by the private plane manufacturers and put with that a certain injection of government for protection of the public interest, and out of it we've created these things. Now certainly we don't need to either nationalize or say we're going to have a market solution. The problem with the market solution, I keep thinking they're going to price natural gas to me about 2 o'clock some morning when it's 30 below zero, and I don't know what it's worth then. It's pretty high at that time of day. So someplace between, I think, and experiment with it. No one knows. No one can tell us. We're in untracked ground, as we are on many others, but this is where we're going to be talking for years, is how do you utilize the fantastic productivity, the free enterprise system with some control to make sure the public interest is protected.
One of the problems that the oil companies have, and it kind of alludes to what has been mentioned here a couple times, is there are at least 20 groups in Washington in the federal government trying to determine and to question oil companies about their policies and practices, and there's no particular liaison between any of them. And we have people going to Washington weekly, every week, to appear before a certain committee to tell us, to answer the same question they answered previously, but there's no communication between the groups that are asking the questions. And you cannot formulate a policy of any type when you have too many people involved. I've seen that in our own company, because I get upset over some of the people telling me what to do. And if it happens in our company, it happens in government. When you have 20 groups of people asking the same questions and then failing to communicate with each other to try to determine the best possible solution, it becomes a very big hodgepodge.
Let's go back to some of the questions that have been referred to earlier. And this was a question that occurred to me in hearing Hubbard and Commoner. I was left with a feeling, I guess, of helplessness in trying to see what an individual could do about some of the problems that they were describing. Commoner, for example, was talking about the extent to which detergents have substituted for soaps, the extent to which plastics have substituted for wood, the extent to which synthetic fibers have substituted for cotton, and where the benefit that was derived from these kinds of substitutions was not particularly desired by me, or I would guess by other members of the public. But these decisions had been made in corporate boardrooms that this is the type of product that should be marketed. Now, is there any way that an individual can get some input into these kinds of decisions? Is this is solely a marketplace decision, and if that is the case, is Commoner fooling us, or how does an individual show what he wants as far as these different options go?
This comes back to the question I raised just a moment ago. We saw a consumer strike affect the price of beef because there are alternatives. Now, if you've got an automobile, I don't know how you could affect by consumer pressures, at least below that limit at which you have to operate in that vehicle. I don't know how you can influence corporate decisions. This comes back to the question, are there vital things? Should blood banks be on the free market system? Is petroleum, is natural gas, is electricity analogous to a blood bank for society as opposed to a hospital? I think those decisions have got got to be faced up to and really defined. I don't think in the federal government, or really in the state government that I have contact with, that kind of a decision has been faced yet, and I think it's a very vital one. There's nothing that will turn off production. You know, if you don't like plastics and everybody else doesn't like plastics, you don't buy plastics, you're not going to see a lot of things made out of plastic. There's absolutely nothing faster. We found out last winter when we were asking, you know, commercial establishments like shopping malls to not heat the entire parking lot through their air baffled doors. The pressure that we as government people, identified as part of the government, could impose on those commercial establishments was as nothing compared to 5 consumers walking in and saying, you know, it stops or I don't work here, or I don't shop here. So I think you've got to decide what's vital to society and take a different route with that than you do on those things that substitutes will provide.
Yeah, I think what we're going to have to do, we're going to have our choice between a massive growth of government, a repressive government, which tells us what we're going to do because these shortages are going to persist and they're going to broaden into other minerals, or we're going to have to learn to look at something and say, that is what I would like to do. For my own sole purposes, that's what I'd like to do. But is that really what's good? If everyone did this, what would the net result be? And get back to plastics. Like Sam said, if plastics are a problem, you know, I might like plastics, but if I might stop and think, well, should all 210 million Americans use plastic, I might come up with another answer. I point that out in transportation. It's great fun to get in the car and charge downtown to a parking lot. But what would happen to all 100,000 people who drive back and forth in this city to work? All of them charged into a car within a 20-minute period went someplace. So if we can have enough self-discipline to stop and look at the overall impact of these individual decisions, we can avoid a massive expansion of government into areas where I think great change has to be made.
Jim, you looked like you had something to say.
Yeah, I think that I would like to just specify an attempt that was made to get into the corporate boardroom. Our statewide environmental organization 2 years ago had a series of discussions with representatives from the major utilities of the state. We made certain recommendations. These recommendations were concerned with attempts to lower the demand for power, and they involved advertising and promotional techniques and others. It became apparent that the way these corporations are structured, there is no way out at the present time gracefully. A utility makes its income from the capital that it has invested, and it pays them to build power plants because this is their only, growth is their only mechanism for income and paying stockholders. Under the present rather uniform utility statutes around the country, this is a common situation. There is no reason, if we're going to entertain, first of all, that we need to limit this growth rate, if we convince ourselves on the basis of information that the growth of energy production, the rate of growth in the use of virginal resources, the per capita consumption of power and resources has to be cut back. Then we begin to address ourselves to the real problem. For example, what kind of a mechanism could we initiate that would reward a utility system for not producing a certain amount of energy? There's no impenetrable barrier there. There's got to be some legitimate way to reward a utility system for not growing at a certain rate, or for penalizing them for growing beyond a certain rate. With respect to resources, I think the same thing is true. But it's a fundamental facing of facts. And I think we're in a period now, nationally, that the awareness of this is on us. But the fear of what it's going to do to our lifestyle overwhelms any real dedication of effort to examine the question of economic growth. Now, as I mentioned before, the Energy Policy Group in the Ford Foundation have attempted to do that. We're going to have to come to grips with the alternatives for lower economic growth and what they are. It means such obvious things as recycling resources. It means production of goods that are not as energy intensive. The alternative to that is really dismal when you begin to examine what it takes in the way of capital investment per individual in this country. For example, the utility industry is approaching $90 billion of capital investment. That's over $400 per person. If we would project our growth rate at the doubling of every 10 years, by the year 2000, we would demand $1,200 to $1,500 from each individual in the United States for capital investment for power production. Look at how many options that cuts out. What could we do with this sort of capital investment? We're beginning to realize that capital just doesn't grow on trees. It's a product of a society's productivity. If we continue to grow at the historical rate, we're going to have to import to the tune of $60 billion of Persian Gulf oil by this same period. What could we do with $60 billion per year of these kinds of resources? We've got to examine alternatives on this basis also. It's not a simple thing. There's no simple answers. I agree with Sam. My TVA example was facetious because it's obvious that TVA and the Department of Interior are in the boardrooms with the decision-making powers as it is right now.
I think, okay, then we'll, after your comment, we'll open it up and get some questions from the audience. Go ahead.
I think you might get the impression that we have corporate boards sitting and making masterful decisions that are all more or less money-grabbing in nature. Actually, they operate very much by trial and error like the rest of us do. And it will be surprising to know the number of errors they've made in which their decisions have been reversed because of lack of public acceptance. And really the final decision under our system is how well a program is received. For example, non-returnable bottles wouldn't last very long if the public didn't buy them. Plastic bags are made for containers for food in many different sizes because the public wants them. We have an example just recently.
For the last 30 years until 1971. Now that rise in 1971 in cost per kilowatt across the country was the factor that initiated this new examination of power and price relationships. And it showed that there is a direct relationship. Now, I've got copies of these that I'll be willing to give you or anybody else, but I'm sure that you've got them down in the office. Now, on that basis, this econometric analysis shows that the decrease in annual demand is going to be less than half of what the Federal Power Commission and the utilities predicted in 1971. Now, those are not my analysis.
Let me remind you, probably the most wasteful consumption of energy for big consumption is in the area of the private automobile. And in 1973, at the same time that everyone really who was involved in the problem knew we had a problem, we sold 12 million automobiles in this country. Now, they tell me the 4.2 million keeps us even. At the end of the year, everybody's got about as good a car as they did to start with. We sold 7.8 million more of those. Now, I agree, I think the public will respond, but in 1973, there are only a handful of areas you can point to, and the sale of 12 million automobiles is not one of them.
Well,
that's the biggest expansion in gasoline-consuming vehicles this nation has ever had.
Charles Berg spoke before the National Academy of Science last February and pointed out that in industry, he's chief engineer for the Federal Power Commission, and he made this analysis of the breakdown of wasted energy in industry and showed that the 7 major industries, which you know, metals, chemistry, cement, paper, and so on, could save within a 5-year period over a third of the energy that they were currently using. Now, the industrial sector uses 40-some% of the energy of this country. And 7 of those major industries account for 3/4 of the industrial share of energy. Now, when you take 1/3 of that off, that's a significant saving. There is no way that you could not explore and find considerable savings in energy and power in any of the sectors, residential and so on. So to try to use the line to the historical growth curve is idiotic.
Question.
I have two questions. One, I think all of you would agree that a big problem is public awareness and understanding of all the problems, looking at the total picture. And what steps can, say, the Iowa government, whoever, take to promote this awareness? Certainly this conference is part of it, but it's only reaching
Can I
a
answer that?
small portion of the people. And my second question is, what steps can also the Iowa government take to, in some sense, force industry or encourage industry to increase their efficiency in use of energy?
I'd answer one. I'll answer the first question.
Could you repeat the question, John?
Okay, the questions, two questions. One is, what can be done to increase public awareness of the energy problems and the choices that have to be made? And the second one is, what can government do to force industry to be more conserving of energy? Is that right?
I'd like to answer the first question, what can the public do? The public can do a number of things with the cooperation of state government. The Iowa Confederation of Environmental Organizations submitted a recommendation to the Midwest Governors Conference, which Sam here chaired last year. And at that meeting, it was suggested that a number of organizations could be formed that would provide input to the public. First of all, I think we have to recognize the legitimacy of a neutral public body brought into the picture of decision-making, at least as spectators. I don't think the public has to actually take part in operating a corporation, but they should be in on the decision-making process. In this case, several recommendations were made. We recommend that a research program should be developed and integrated on environmental energy and resources, funded by public endowment. Now, this speaks to the question that, for example, of a model strip mine. We believe that an energy committee composed of capable citizens should be appointed to review as part of the decision-making process. We recommended a utility siting board be established of private citizens. Now, thirdly, I think in the case of technological decisions that get complexed with a lot of scientific and technical information, a body such as the Iowa Academy of Science would be a legitimate body to set up committees for anticipating long-range technology and providing this kind of an input on a regular basis. Now, given adequate support and publicity to these kinds of arrangements, I think there'd be a much better distribution of information to the public. There certainly is a dismal process afoot right now. That's the first question.
I think those are constructive recommendations. We've been going at this for about 2 hours now. I think we're down to our hardcore energy concerned persons. I think we'll turn it back to you now, Dwight.
I want to thank you folks for coming out and listening to these folks, and for these folks coming out and talking to us folks. That makes it kind of folksy. I almost feel like breaking out my guitar and singing.
Whatever folks saw.
Seriously, we do want to thank both the audience for its participation and this group for its participation in what is basically a very, very serious, long-range, and not thoroughly answered set of problems. Thank you very much. We can all go away now and burn up some energy in our automobiles. And then, thank you very much.
Most of these slides are in the publications that are listed in this bibliography. This technological age sometimes gets us. Can I get these? You might have to move that. Look, move this one around. The first slide is an attempt to depict the total energy system of the Earth. This energy system consists essentially of two parts. One is certain stored energy within the ground. If we think of this bar across here as being the surface of the Earth, is a term that's required when we deal with something like a waterfall. There is no amount of energy that can be assigned to a waterfall. Energy is continuously being dissipated into heat, and the amount of energy depends on how long the fall operates. So the measure that is appropriate to a waterfall then is the rate at which energy is transferred, which we call power. Now, in this flow sheet at the top, these quantities below are energy, stored energy. The quantity at the top is are rates of energy transformation. Now, into the Earth's surface environment, there are three principal inputs of energy. One of those is the solar radiation intercepted by the Earth's diametral plane, which is pouring in steadily from the radiant energy leaving the sun. There's another input to the Earth, which is obtained from the Earth-Moon-Sun system, which is tidal energy and is dissipated as tidal friction. The other input is the heat coming out of the Earth. If we dig a well or hole in the ground at any place, the temperature increases with depth, and therefore heat must be conducting toward the surface, and in other cases it's coming up in the form of molten rocks of volcanoes and hot springs, etc. Now, as to what happens to this energy, the magnitudes of these inputs, incident to the unit that we're using here, is 10 to the 12th, or 1 trillion thermal watts. That's simply the heat equivalent. It's the same kind of watt that you pay your electric light bill for, or you speak of when you speak of a 100-watt lamp. A watt is simply the thermal watt is the heat that would be generated 100 thermal watts by a 100-watt lamp. Now, in terms of this unit, the energy from the sun that is intercepted by the Earth's diametral plane and the power that is intercepted or that's pouring into the Earth is 174,000 times this unit of 10 to the 12th watts. The energy that's coming from the Earth-Moon-Sun system as tidal energy is only 3 times 10 to the 12th watts, and the heat that's coming out of the ground is only about 32 times 10 to the 12th watts. So you'll see at a glance that the input in the surface energy of the Earth from solar radiation simply dwarfs these other two. In fact, it is roughly 5,000 times the sum of all other inputs. Now, what happens to this energy in the rest of the sequence? Well, in the case of solar energy, approximately 30%, or roughly a third, is directly reflected, largely by the cloud cover of the Earth, and goes back into outer space. It's scattered, and it does nothing. It leaves the Earth as visible radiation, which accounts for the white cloud cover that you can see from space photographs. It's visible. The remaining 70% of that input, however, is what causes things to happen or circulate the material systems of the Earth. One part of this does nothing but heat. About roughly half of the total input here simply warms the atmosphere and the ground and the oceans, and ultimately leaves the Earth as long wavelength radiation corresponding to the surface temperature of the Earth. Another fraction, roughly a quarter of this total input, goes to circulate, evaporate, precipitate water, and circulate the air and the moisture, and is responsible, among other things, for our hydrologic cycle, our flowing streams, and in case of human activities, ultimately water power. There's a very small fraction in here of 1%, only about 40 times 10 to the 12th watts, which is captured by the green leaves of plants, and by the process of photosynthesis, this energy is used to combine the common inorganic materials of water and carbon dioxide into plant carbohydrates and other more complex plant chemicals. And in the process, this energy, solar energy, is stored chemically in these plant materials. Now, small as it is, this is a very, very important fraction of this whole system, because that is the basic physiological energy for the entire plant and animal kingdoms. The plants, the normal sequence, they decay, which means they oxidize. The energy is released commonly as low temperature heat, and the materials go back to carbon dioxide and water and can be used over again. But the heat is low temperature, and it leaves the earth. An exception to this is the case of fire, where we have the same reaction approximately, except that it occurs rapidly and at high temperature. But the end products are ultimately the same. Also, this energy is the input for the animal kingdom, the herbivores, carnivores, parasites, the whole food chain, including ourselves. We're right in this thing. We're omnivores. We eat everything, and plant and animal. Now, another thing that happens, ordinarily, this is nearly an almost completely balanced system when averaged over a few years. But at the present time, and for long periods of the past, a minute fraction of this organic material gets deposited in peat bogs and other situations of insufficient oxygen and therefore cannot completely decay. These deposits have gotten buried in sedimentary sands and muds over the geologic past and have become our fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, etc. The end product, and so the fossil fuels are simply stored solar energy, stored chemically, over a long, long period of the geologic past. All of this dynamical system, except the storage, simply ultimately goes to low temperature, the surface environment of the Earth, and leaves the Earth as a part of a balanced system. Now, this has been going on for a long time. It changes in detail, and at the present time, the human species is tampering with this diagram in various ways and has been doing so for over 1 million years. I'll touch upon that presently. The next slide, please. Now, another part of this picture is the time scale. Most of us carry a time scale in our head measured in terms of a few centuries in the past and a few decades in the future. Most of us think of history begins to get rather vague, shall we say, prior to the time our ancestors settled in the United States. If we want to take a real bold look into the future, we sometimes will venture to look as far as, say, the end of this century, the year 2000. But the time scale that one requires to understand any phenomenon has to be long enough to encompass all aspects of the thing we're looking at. So the time scale I'd like to show you here is a bar chart at the top of 4.5 billion years from the present. The present back to 4.5 billion years. Now, from the dating of meteorites, there's a consistent or a convergence toward a figure of about 4.5 billion years determined by radioactive contents, which appears to be the time at which the catastrophic astronomical event occurred, which created the solar system, including the Earth. Now, the Earth itself, we have a record which is decipherable from the rocks from the order of 3 billion years on up to the present. The oldest rock so far recorded or measured on Earth has a date of about 3.8 billion years in Greenland. The oldest organisms that I know of are in rocks from South Africa, perfectly good microbes, in chert rocks about 3.2 billion years. And we have then organisms must have originated somewhere in this region before 3 billion years, although there's very little record up until about 570 million years ago, when the fossil remains become rather abundant. So we divide geological history into this Precambrian eon, as it is now called, and then this period beginning with the Cambrian, which is also called the Phanerozoic eon, the last 570 million years. If we blow up this last chart and take a look at it, this is significant, as I say, because we have a good record of organic evolution during this period. It is also the period during which our present fossil fuels have accumulated. The oldest gas deposits that I know of are in Australia, estimated about 600 million years ago. And in the United States, we have oil and gas in rocks of all geologic ages, from the Cambrian right on up to the last million years in coastal Louisiana. Coal, the period of around 300 million years ago, is the time of the accumulation of the earliest large coal deposits in the United States, England, Western Europe. in what used to be called the Carboniferous because of its coal content. Then we have coals that are younger coals in the Rocky Mountain region of the U.S. that are subbituminous largely, and then finally lignites and right on up to peat beds which are accumulating at the present time. Another aspect of this organic evolution I might hastily mention was that apparently there were no land plants in this earlier stage up until around between 400 and 500 million years ago. Excuse me, my technology is getting away from me here. The plants got out on the land before that. The earth must have been rather barren, something like the moon, except had running water. And then from that time on, we've had an earth coverage of plants. The original animals were shells, and crustaceans, a very abundant little animal called a trilobite, 2 or 3 inches across. They crawled in the shallow waters. Finally, the vertebrates emerged, huge fishes, by about 400 million years ago. Pretty soon, they began to develop lungs and live partly on land, and legs, and became amphibians. A little later, the amphibians could live totally on land, became reptiles, and we have the great flowering of the reptiles, the dinosaurs and so on, during the Mesozoic, this period of 65 to 200 million years ago. At the end of this time, the dinosaurs became extinct, the mammals emerged, and from that time on, the last 65 million years, the animals began to look more and more like those of the present time as we approach the present. Now, I'd like particularly to call your attention to this last approximately 2 or 3 million years over here, which we call the Quaternary period. And that is geologically best known as the period of the great continental glaciations, which covered North America and Northern Europe. I believe this territory here was covered by it. And, but biologically, this is also the period of the emergence of our ancestors, our human ancestors, to where they begin to look rather like us, more so than they had previously. The Leakeys have been excavating over in Tanzania during last 25 or 30 years, and digging up humanoid forms which walked on their hind legs, apparently used crude stone tools. And we have scattered archaeological evidences of the human species during all this approximately 2 million years, but not very much. The record's rather sparse until recently. But we know a lot of things happened during this period for which there's not a clean record. Just to mention a few, this human animal throughout this period has been messing with that flow diagram that we saw in the first screen, as in a manner that no other animal ever did before. For example, somewhere around 1 million years ago, he learned to build a fire. No other animal in this entire span of history ever built a fire before. He also developed clothing, housing, clubs, and so in general, he was tampering with the ecology in such a manner as to increase the energy supply of this system for his own uses. But it was all very, very slow. Finally, that vertical line there, to give you another part of this time scale, is the last 5,000 years, which goes back to what we ordinarily consider as the beginning of recorded history. Now, I should also call your attention to that there's certain deceptiveness about this chart. And that is that geological history appears to end with us. I think that is a fundamental or a misleading impression. And a much more accurate impression would be that we're not at the end of geological history, we're somewhere near the middle of it. In other words, there's probably several billion years more of geological history after we're gone. All we are right now is simply the dominant animal on the earth and the analog of the dinosaurs back here 65 to 200 million years. And like the dinosaurs, there's no expectation that we'll be here forever either. That we are also ephemeral. Now, as I say, this period this animal has been tampering with the energy system in general in such a manner as to increase his own uses of energy. Finally, there's domestication of plants and animals about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. The ancient Egyptians used a little bit of wind power for their ships on the Nile. The ancient Romans used a slight amount of water power. Of course, they used animal power much earlier than that. Also, the smelting of metals occurred about 5,000 years ago. In the case of the non-ferrous metals, about 1,500 years later for iron, using wood for fuel. But the record is sparse. The rate of change was very, very slow until when the human animal finally discovered a very large concentrated source of energy that was capable of exploiting at a much more rapid rate. The next slide. That was when the mining of coal began in Newcastle on the northeast coast of England about 9 centuries ago. The people around Newcastle apparently discovered certain black rocks found along the seashore would burn. They called them sea coals. They could obviously see where they were coming from. The wave was undercutting the coal bed, and they started digging holes, digging coal. And they've been digging coal in Newcastle right up to about a month ago when they had a recess for a few weeks. Until now. Now, as I say, we have scattered statistics, but the quantity was so small you can't plot it. And here's the plot of the coal production of the world annually since 1860, approximately back to 1820. So you'll see at a glance, bearing in mind that coal production had been increasing about 2% per year for 700 years before 1800. The magnitude still was so small that it is just dwarfed by what's happened principally since, well, the last century. Saying another way, the amount of coal mined in the world since 1940 exceeds somewhat all the coal produced prior to that time during the preceding 900 years. The next slide, please. This same evolution is shown in another way if we plot the rate of production on a logarithmic scale versus time. And this has the advantage, it's more informative in a way, than that is that if it plots as a straight line, that is indicative of a uniform exponential rate of growth. A uniform exponential rate of growth is a quantity that increases a fixed percentage of itself per year and doubles in equal intervals of time. So from 1860 to World War I about, the growth rate of coal production was about 4.2% per year, doubling about every 16.5 years. After World War I and through the Depression, World War II, there was a great slowdown to less than 1% per year, and then a speed up again subsequent to World War II, up to about 3% per year, and doubling about every 23 years. Next slide. The second major source of fossil fuel energy was oil. Much later, the exploitation of crude oil for industrial purposes began in Romania as a continuous enterprise in 1857 and the United States in 1859. And we have continuous statistics of oil production from that date. Now here's the curve of the rate of production of crude oil in the world from 1880 to the present, and you'll see at a glance that that's almost a uniform exponential growth right up to now. The next slide. Plotting the same data on semi-logarithmic paper, we see that actually initially the growth rate was higher, but the quantity was so small that it was insignificant. And then we settled down to this almost straight line, a little aberration, but not much, growth rate, and up to now, a rate of 7% per year, doubling every 9.8 years. Stated another statement is that the amount of oil that has been produced during the last 10 years is equal to all the oil produced prior to that time, again to emphasize the magnitude of what's happening during the times of the lifetimes of us in this room. Next slide, please. How do oil and coal compare with each other as major sources of industrial energy? Well, here's a plot using the energy of the heat of combustion of these fuels. The bottom curve here is coal and lignite. The shaded area is the additional oil energy added by crude oil, and the upper curve is the sum of the two. What you'll note is that until 1900, oil was insignificant. After that, it got bigger and bigger as compared with coal, and to where now it is bigger than coal, and if we added natural gas there, the two together would be a little, perhaps 2/3 or so of the total. Pardon my fumbling with the technology here. It keeps coming apart. The next slide, please. Now, let's look at the United States. The United States, the statistics of coal mining start in 1820, when I think it's recorded about 14 tons. Now, undoubtedly, there's more coal than that, but these are the recorded statistics. Here's the coal production from, I said 1820. From 1840 to the present is the total coal curve of coal production, and you'll see the uniform exponential growth up until about World War I, and then finally we break off to about 500 million metric tons per year with rather wide oscillations. Now, this is all kinds of coal: anthracite, bituminous, and lignite. Now, the only anthracite in the United States are a couple of thin strips of the eastern coal basin in eastern Pennsylvania and Virginia. The mining of anthracite has been principally in Pennsylvania, and this is a production figure from around 1840 until recently in anthracite. I'm showing you that because it represents almost a complete cycle of the mining of an exhaustible resource. We start at zero, we go exponentially up and finally slow down, go over a hump about 1918 in this case, and then we go down, we're almost back to zero now. Now, that doesn't say we've taken all the anthracite out of the ground, but it very plainly says that we've almost quit mining anthracite because of the increasing difficulties and costs. The next slide, please. Now, on a semi-logarithmic plot, straight line growth right up to that little peak was the year 1907, I think, and then we nearly level off. That growth rate was 6.7% per year, doubling every 10.4 years up to that break around 1907 to 10 or so. The next slide, please. Here's the corresponding plot on crude oil production. I said we started with crude oil production in 1859 when the original discovery was made in Titusville, Pennsylvania. The original rate of growth was higher, as in the case of the world, for a decade or two, and then we settled down to a straight line growth which broke at the break of the Depression following 1929. Here's the Depression, and then there was a gradual growth but slowed down until that last little peak up there is the year 1970. This growth rate during the exponential phase was 8.3% per year, doubling every 8.4 years. We might keep that figure in mind. I want to refer to it later. The next slide, please. Now, total energy, industrial energy, from coal, oil, gas, water power, and a tiny bit of nuclear power is shown on this curve on a semi-logarithmic plot. With the same straight line growth, that same little peak in 1907, growth rate of 6.9% per year, doubling exactly every 10 years on the average, and then a breakaway to less than 2% per year, rather abruptly, around 1910 or so. And with a doubling period increased to 39 years, and then finally there's a takeoff during the last 10 years at an intermediate rate, and I'm not quite sure what caused that. But this event here is plainly a very major event in American industrial history, and we didn't even know it happened. The next slide, please. Now, looking at those curves, I think we're almost forced to ask ourselves, or can hardly refrain from asking ourselves the question, what about the future? How long can we keep this up? What's going to happen? And so on. The question is sometimes asked, how long will the coal and oil last? Well, one of the principles that we can utilize in trying to answer that question is the following. That anthracite curve gave you a pretty good example, and that is what I call a complete cycle